My name is Kenneth Harrell, and I'm a professor of history at Tulane University in New Orleans, where I teach Greek, Roman, Byzantine, and Crusader history. And I'm going to lead you through a set of 36 lectures which will deal with the origins, impact, course of the Crusades, which ran from 1095 to 1291. It's a subject of interest to many students of history. It's been subject to all sorts of romantic interpretations. And what I would like to do in this initial lecture is to discuss what do we mean by the Crusades and the period of the Crusades or the era of the Crusades. I then wish to address some of the popular perceptions and even misperceptions of what the Crusades are all about. And then in the third part of this lecture, I want to set the stage for our lectures to come by sketching out the three civilizations which were involved in these ventures, and that is the medieval Islamic world, the world of the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire, that is the successor to the old Roman Empire in the eastern lands of the former Roman world, and also Western Christendom, or what we would call today Western Europe, but Christendom is actually a better term. By the time we end with this course, we may begin to start speaking of Europe, or Western Europe as we understand it. So let me start first with what are the Crusades all about. There are 8 canonical Crusades that are often taught in textbooks, and let's just stop for a moment and think about what those Crusades are. They are the First Crusade, which launched this whole venture and took Jerusalem in 1099. It was preached in 1095. It was first and most successful of Crusades. There was a Second Crusade led by 2 great kings of Europe from 1146 to 1148. Another great royal crusade with Richard Lionhearted, who's well known to everyone. That's in 1189, 1192, and it turned out to be something of a disappointment because it didn't retake the city of Jerusalem, which had fallen. The Fourth Crusade, we'll find out, is a pivotal crusade. It's a crusade that was to help Jerusalem but ended up taking Constantinople, and that crusade acts as a pivotal point. And then the last 4 crusades in the canonical 8 were led, or were supposed to be led, by 2 great royal crusaders, Frederick II, that would be the 5th and 6th Crusades, and St. Louis of France. Now, the reason why these 8 are given numbers, and there are some other crusades mentioned. There's the so-called People's Crusade, the Crusade of 1101, which I affectionately call Crusade 1.5. Is that their size. These were great expeditions launched by either the nobility or the monarchies of Europe, involving, in some cases, as much as 100,000 people, not all soldiers, but many of them pilgrims, who moved east with the avowed aim of taking Jerusalem. And that's an important point to stress, that crusades, both in their size and their objective, is probably what gets them that number, that they were intended to take back the holy places, the birthplace of Christianity, which most Christians saw as literally the center of the world. The lesser crusades, the ones that didn't get numbers like the Crusade of 1101, which just missed it, and some of the others that we'll encounter, these were more in the tradition of armed pilgrimages, that is the travel out to see Jerusalem without necessarily having the same dimensions of a full crusade. And I think that difference in size and also objective is very important, and clearly was understood even at the time that there were certain great crusades and then there were lesser ventures. Furthermore, it's another point I wish to stress, that the period of the Crusades closes when Jerusalem is no longer the objective. And the use of the term crusade as a general term for religious war is really an extension of the term that comes out of the Fourth Crusade and this thing known as the Albigensian Crusade, a crusade preached against heretics in southern France in the 13th century. And that leads us into a very different direction. And as I would strictly define crusade in its medieval sense, they really start to fall outside the bounds of the course. And after 1291, the crusading period is over. Well, what do we mean by all of these images of crusades? How have they been perceived? Why is there a great interest, especially in popular opinion? It appears in novels, it appears in movies, television shows. All sorts of legendary figures are associated with the Crusades. Well, for one, there's a very widespread romantic perception that goes back to the Middle Ages. And many of the princes and knights of Western Europe assume the cross, that is, they pledge to go to Jerusalem and liberate the Holy City, and they did so as a display of their honor and chivalry. And crusading activity over the course of the 12th and 13th century was very much a display of the nobility and chivalry expected of the military caste of Western Europe. It was really very much a family tradition. Many of the families that went out on crusade in 1096, their descendants continued to go on crusades. And there was a whole tradition of living up to the great ancestors, or in several instances, as in the case of the kings of France, trying to erase the memories of a disgraceful performance on an earlier crusade. Western Europeans came to define their values far more sharply by going on crusades. And this is seen, for instance, in their reaction to perhaps the greatest of the Muslim commanders of the time, Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt, who was seen as almost a better example of chivalry than most of the Western Europeans on crusade. And hailed as, in many ways, the supreme example of a chivalrous man. And these notions feed very much into our romantic notions of the Middle Ages. And the idea that the Templars, the Hospitallers, these men who fused a religious vocation, they were in effect a religious order, like a monastic order, but at the same time they were warriors, they were dedicated to the defense of the faith, the defense of the Holy City. These emerged in the early 12th century at Jerusalem. They're looked upon as the epitome of chivalry. They, again, of course, are figures that are quite common in novel and romance, starting in the Middle Ages and running to the present day. And so a good deal of these romantic images come very much out of the epic, the chanson de geste, the troubadour poetry created in the 12th and 13th centuries. And they are still a powerful image. The term crusader very often is a flattering term. Not always. Sometimes it's ironic. Sometimes it's derogatory. But someone going on a crusade is supposedly doing this action for some kind of noble reasons. On the other hand, in more recent generations, there's been a darker side stressed of the Crusades and reinterpretations of what this historical movement meant. The dramatic expansion of national states of Western Europe, especially in the late 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, led to a real reinterpretation of the Crusader movement. Now, some of these were very positive and others are not so positive, and these images are still very powerful today. In the 19th century, the French, above all, since many of the earliest Crusaders were Franks or French, the French spent a great deal of interest on the Crusades. Some of the finest works in early Crusader scholarship are written by French scholars. They stressed the idea of the Crusades as the first step in nationalism, in the sense of imperial nationalism with the great missions in Africa and East Asia. The Crusades were the start of France's mission in the holy places, claims to the area of the Ottoman Empire, its colonial mission in Algeria. Germans picked up on these themes. German intellectuals and politicians, encouraged by Bismarck, cast the great Crusader king Frederick Barbarossa as the first great national king of Germany. That the Third Crusade, actually Frederick was also on the Second Crusade, but the Third Crusade was the great national German effort. That Frederick unfortunately died an untimely and really unseemly death. He drowned in a not so important river in Turkey, and that someday he would come back and reawaken the German nation. He becomes almost an Arthurian figure in this German nationalism of the 19th century. But there's another side at looking at these more modern images, and this becomes particularly common in perceptions in popular literature after the Second World War. The Crusades can be seen as the first of a series of European imperial ventures into the Islamic and also the Greek Orthodox, the Eastern Christian worlds. And these are not such friendly images. The Crusaders are cast as religious fanatics, men brandishing their swords in the name of religion, but really acting out of political motives, out of avarice. And there is some evidence to support this, some very good evidence. The sack of Jerusalem on the 15th of July in 1099 was a disgraceful act that shocked the Islamic world. The Crusaders burst into the city and butchered the Jewish and Muslim populations. There were ugly pogroms, and that's what they really were, the slaughter of Jewish residents resistance in cities in the Rhineland by members of the People's Crusade. And one could multiply the examples of religious intolerance, the general failure of the Christians coming from Western Europe to understand Islam at all on its own terms, and the lack of Western Europeans, even after 200 years of residence in what is called Outre-mer, that is the Crusader states set up in the Levant, that is the lands across the sea in French, of any understanding of Islamic theology, the Quran, all the great achievements of Islam. So these are images that are very powerful. It's led to criticisms not only in Western Europe, but they've been revived by Arab nationalists. Today, one of the most derogatory terms you can throw at a Western European or a North American is a Frangi, a Frank, a Crusader. Most of the first Crusaders were from France. They were Franks, and this is still a derogatory term in the Islamic world. And so these images are extremely powerful, these negative images, and they balance this romantic tradition going back to the Middle Ages, as well as these 19th century nationalist interpretations. So the Crusades are really a remarkable phenomenon coming out of the Middle Ages, still being debated, still being discussed today, and still being seen as having an immediate influence on our world, especially on the Middle East. Well, let's take some of these assumptions and explain and elucidate that they're not the whole story at all. They are based in a certain amount of facts, but there's a couple of points we should remember before we venture on to these lectures. Religious warfare and fanaticism was by no means the monopoly of the Western Europeans in the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries. Far from it. Members of all three of those civilizations, the Islamic, the Byzantine world, and of course Western Christendom, all agreed that there was such a thing as religious war, and it was to be waged under certain circumstances. Islam was a faith born with jihad, that is, holy war. There is an articulated ideology of holy war, the expansion of the heartland of Islam, the war against the unbelievers. This is a notion that goes right back to Muhammad. It is still a premise in Islam. It's invoked in various ways and fashions down to this day. On the other hand, the Muslims did have, especially in the era before the Crusades, a rather articulate and by the standards of the age, a tolerant treatment and policy towards the non-believers, the Christians, the Jews, Zoroastrians. They were treated as second-class citizens. They were disarmed, but nonetheless, they were not to be destroyed. They were not to be slain in some act of fanaticism. Even though there might be disgraceful acts of destroying a city, this was not policy. And so the Muslims very early had to come to terms with the fact that they ruled a majority of non-Muslim subjects. Western Europeans, on the other hand, actually had to progress to the notion of crusade and holy war. It's not in the New Testament. You had to go back and fuse Roman notions of a just war. The Romans always assure us that they never waged an unjust war. In Roman texts, certainly from the 2nd century BC, the Romans actually have a special official rite in which they justify their wars, usually combined with the claim that their envoys had been unceremoniously murdered by the offending power. And so that tradition fed in. It was known to St. Augustine, writing in the 5th century. It could be fused with Old Testament visions of religious war, that is, the Israelites conquering Canaan and throwing down the idols. And furthermore, there was a long tradition of converting pagans, heathens in Central and Northern Europe by the sword. Charlemagne, the great emperor of the Carolingian state, is reputed to have slain many Saxons who refused conversion on the banks of the Weser. There were forced conversions across Central and Europe and in Scandinavia. These could be easily justified with the whole martial ethos that comes out of the Celtic and Teutonic peoples of Western Europe. And so by 1095, there were a number of traditions feeding into religious warfare. Even the Byzantines themselves, the great heirs of the Roman tradition, who styled themselves as the most, in a sort of sanctimonious way by Western European standards, styled themselves as the heirs of the classical tradition. They were the true Romans. Even they had notions of religious warfare. There is an incident that's often cited that the Emperor Nicephorus Phocas in the 10th century, really a irascible fellow, one of my favorite emperors, that he approached the then reigning patriarch, Polydeuctus, and said, give us remission of sins. That is, if you die in battle against the Muslims, imperial soldiers will go to heaven. And the patriarch answers, I can't do this because by the fact that you have blood on your hands, you've broken one of God's commandments. And this incident is often cited as an example. Well, the Byzantines really didn't have religious warfare the way the Western Europeans or even the Muslims, and that's not true. Imperial armies, Byzantine imperial armies, repeatedly went into battle under religious symbols. The most common depictions on the rock-cut churches of Cappadocia of the 10th and 11th centuries in Central Asia Minor are the saints St. Theodore and St. George, who on a number of occasions are claimed to have fought in the ranks of imperial armies, to have given victory. And there's a number of cases where the Byzantines fought under religious symbols, and these symbols were extremely powerful. And you have to remember, all armies went into battle under religious symbols, whether they be Muslim, whether they be Christian, whether they be Greek Orthodox. There would be sermons, there would be stirring speeches, appeals to the faith, and that's extremely important. And it was accepted by all the great religions of the Middle Ages that war in defense of the faith was justifiable or to expand the faith. So this is one preconception that should be removed, and I think it enables us to look at how the traditions of warfare did differ in the Islamic, Western Christian, and Byzantine worlds, and that is a subject we'll get into later on, dealing with the origins of crusading and armed pilgrimage. Well, with those images, that background, I'd like to conclude this lecture with a discussion of the three civilizations under study. One of the reasons why the era of the Crusades is so important is that it brings these three civilizations, three related civilizations, the Islamic world, Byzantium, and Western Christendom, together. That's not to say they were in complete isolation before the era of the Crusades, but the contact had been considerably more limited. Furthermore, in many ways, the era of the Crusades is the climax to a whole number of changes in institutions, economic development, religious attitudes in all three of these civilizations, which can be traced back to a common parent, that is the late Roman world. All three civilizations had a common origin, perhaps less so Islam because it had a secondary tradition in Iran and farther east, but all three of these civilizations in one way or another could style themselves as the heirs to the great Roman cultural, political, and religious traditions of the 4th century, especially with that great Christian emperor Constantine. Well, let's look at the Islamic world first. Certainly by whatever standards we wish to measure a civilization. In 1095, when Pope Urban II preached the First Crusade, the Islamic world was clearly to be regarded as perhaps without doubt, the most successful civilization. The only other rival it had was classical China, the so-called Sung Empire on the other end of the Eurasian landmass. And the Islamic world was premised on a very important notion that political and spiritual authority rested in a single person, the Caliph, the successor of Muhammad. Muhammad was the final prophet of God. He had given God's final revelation, and by the time of the Crusades, certainly by the time of the 9th century, the Quran was regarded as the uncreated word of God. That is the direct revelation by God through Muhammad. Absolutely no interpretation. What was recorded in the Quran were the words of God. And the Caliph was the heir to this tradition. The Caliph ruled over an ummah, a community of believers that embraced all Muslims. And Muslim is a term that means he who submits, or that is, who submits to the will of God, to the will of Allah. And Allah is simply the Arabic word for God. And that all political and religious life issued from the Caliph and his agents, and so that the notion of a split between a spiritual and a secular world is really very artificial. And in this sense, the Islamic world is very much in line with the vision of the Emperor Constantine, the first Christian emperor who established a Christian Roman state and who saw himself in this position of combining both secular and religious authority. Not to the degree of the caliph, but he was often called as the equal of the apostles and was put on par with the ecclesiastical authorities of the Roman world. And I always think that if Constantine had visited the Byzantine, Islamic, and Western European worlds on the eve of the Crusades, in some ways the Islamic world would be far more congenial to him than even East Rome and Constantinople, where his capital was centuries later. On the other hand, the Muslims were divided on exactly who had claims to that religious authority. In 1095, we shall see that there were at least two, probably, well, if you want to bring in the Spanish caliph, which no one really except the Spaniards cared about, there are two choices of caliph. There was a division over this issue of succession. One was the caliph in Baghdad, often known as a Sunni caliph, that is the Orthodox, what came to be the majority opinion in the Islamic world, and that authority claimed to have control over the whole Islamic world. The other choice was Cairo, where there was a Fatimid caliph, a caliph that represented the Shiite and the Aliyid sectarians and offered a different vision of the Islamic world, a different vision of authority, with Ali as virtually a figure on par with Muhammad. And there was a major civil war, in effect, raging between Cairo and Baghdad over which regime would become the caliphate. And this played to the advantage of the Crusaders, who arrived in the Near East at a time where this war was going on, and it divided Islamic authority very bitterly. And in the course of the Crusades, that issue is going to be resolved. Eventually, it is not going to be the Fatimid Caliphate or the other sectarian caliphates. It's going to be the Abbasid and ultimately the descendants of the Abbasid Caliphate that will triumph. Also, the Islamic world, being extremely successful in many ways, it should be remembered that it was politically fragmented. That whatever the caliph said, whether in Cairo and Baghdad, there were numerous political orders that were really outside of his control, that most of the Islamic world was divided up into the hands of different dynasts who protested their loyalty to a caliph, but really essentially ruled their regimes on their own. And they ruled over states which to a large extent were still a majority of non-Muslims. Christians, Jews, in Eastern Islam, Buddhists, Zoroastrians clearly formed the majority. And again, this would change as a result of the Crusades. We can spend less time on the Byzantine world, the Eastern Roman Empire, because that empire was a great bureaucratic state. I've lectured on it before, and it really was very much the successor to the late Roman state I just described. The Byzantine emperors ruled from Constantinople, and in Constantinople, the same notion that spiritual and secular authority were closely associated, or not maybe the same person, but the patriarch of the Orthodox Church and the Orthodox Emperor of Constantinople resided in the same capital. And contrary to many popular opinions, it wasn't that the patriarch was the chaplain of the emperor, far from it. Patriarch and emperor were seen as two figures who cooperated. When they disagreed, that was seen as a schism, as a cutting. That was very disquieting to most Orthodox believers. The norm was cooperation. The secular and spiritual worlds were essentially part of the same, and religious identity was the key way of identifying oneself in the Byzantine Empire. Were you Orthodox? Did you give your loyalty to the Orthodox Church and Empire? It also was, up until just before the Crusades, a generation before the Crusades, the greatest military and political state in Christendom. It did suffer a crushing defeat at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, and actually the Crusades are ignited by an appeal of the Emperor Alexis I for military aid from Western Europeans to take back historic lands lost to the Seljuk Turkish invaders, these Muslims who occupied Asia Minor. And then that brings us to our third civilization, Western Europe. I like to always put it that Western Europe went on crusade in the world of the Romanesque cathedral and emerged out of the Crusades in the High Gothic. That perhaps is a simplification, but in many ways, Western European society and civilization underwent the most dramatic changes as a result of the two centuries of crusading. And Western Europe also highlights the fact that in dealing with the Crusades, and this will become quite evident in the coming lectures, this is not simply going to be a set of lectures on Crusades 1 through 8. The Crusades were far more than just those 8 military expeditions. that the impact of the Crusades, its influence on political institutions, on economic change, on religious life, on the very identity of Western Europeans far transcended just those expeditions. And a good deal of what we're going to be looking at is analyzing the repercussions and impact of those Crusades with Western Europe as our main focus, and then also trying to give as much attention that we can for the Islamic and Byzantine worlds that were also very much influenced by these ventures. But as to Western Europe at the start of the Crusades, clearly it was not on the same level as the other two civilizations. Whereas the Islamic world and the Byzantine Empire presented the images of very powerful civilizations, both of them with some kind of bureaucratic state, with a powerful ruler who could get his will done, who could collect taxes, and both states with the notion that political and spiritual authority essentially rested in the same place, in a great capital city, Baghdad or Cairo in the Islamic world, Constantinople in the Byzantine world. That was not what obtained in Western Europe. In 1095, there was a great religious capital in Europe. That was Rome. Rome had emerged as the religious center of Western Europe. Part of that was through a historical accident, that the popes in Rome claimed to be the true successors of Peter. They were the only Petrine see, that is, apostolic see, that could trace its descent back to an unbroken succession of bishops all the way to Peter. And they were the only see in Western Europe that had that claim. The others were in what is, in 1095, either the Byzantine Empire or the Islamic world. Furthermore, Rome had been the capital of the Roman Empire, especially the Western Roman Empire that had collapsed in 476. So the popes also inherited all of the legitimacy and respect, the mantle of the late Roman emperors. And so in the papacy in Rome were the religious authority of the Western Church, as well as all those Roman imperial traditions. However, political authority, that is secular authority, was not in Rome. In Western Europe, the majority of kingdoms, and really the main power were the principalities and the feudal states of Western Europe, the majority of these states were founded by Germanic, in some cases Celtic rulers, who, while they gave their allegiance to the Pope in Rome as their spiritual father, essentially governed regional churches and regional states. And even in their own kingdoms, their power was very, very much restricted by custom, and real power was at the regional and local level among the great feudal lords in the states that came out of the Carolingian Empire, or in other types of strong, powerful figures, old Celtic chiefdoms and the Celtic fringe, local rulers in Anglo-Saxon England. So Western Europe presented a very, very different picture. Here, spiritual and political authority were not one and the same. There was this peculiar division. And on the eve of the Crusades, this issue is being battled out. Exactly what is the relationship between in Western Europe between the papacy and the various political figures of Western Europe? What was the relationship of spiritual and secular on the abstract level? Which was superior? The popes always claimed that, of course, the spiritual was, and they were in charge of it. Monarchs in Western Europe tended to disagree. This leads to a series of debates, disputes, the so-called investiture controversy, and to some extent, the Crusades are connected with this debate. They don't solve the debate, far from it. They actually widen the arena in which this debate will be played out. And it also is a debate that leads to peculiar developments in Western Europe, to a division of these two authorities and the emergence of the Western European nation-state order, which is quite distinct from the older traditions closer to the Roman world that you see in the Orthodox Empire Byzantium and the Islamic world. And I always put it this way: at the start of the Crusades, I think most of the Muslims and Byzantines were really quite perplexed. Who was ever in charge of these expeditions? They would be preached by the Pope, nobles might show up, kings might show up. It was a very, very peculiar venture to the Byzantines and Muslims, and it reflected the unusual nature of European society, which had evolved along different lines and had diverged from its Roman traditions in some ways far more than either the other two civilizations. And that's a point that's important to stress because it's often overlooked. The Western Europeans had built their civilization on a set of local institutions and premises that were not necessarily Roman. They were Germanic, they were Celtic, in some cases pre-Roman. So with those three civilizations, what we plan to do is to address this course in really three parts. We're going to look at the whole origins of the crusading movement in the first 12 lectures. We are then going to move to the first century of the Crusades, and for convenience, I call that the 12th century. That is from the capture of Jerusalem in 1099 to the collapse of the kingdom at the Battle of Hattin, July 1187. I would say 2/3 of those lectures are going to be dealing with the political and historical narrative. And then we're going to spend 4 lectures on cultural exchange, economic impact, and a number of other thematic issues that came out of the 12th century. And then finally, in the last third of this class, we're going to deal with the last century of crusading. And those set of lectures, likewise, will combine both narrative as well as economic and cultural change. You will note that throughout this course, there will be a real effort to address not only what went on in Western Europe, but also what went on in the Byzantine world and in the Muslim world. And it is necessary to see all 3 perspectives because all 3 civilizations were at play. There's constant influence among the 3, and the consequences, while maybe different for each civilization, were nonetheless profound. And all 3 civilizations came through this experience greatly transformed. So with that introduction, we shall now turn to the first part of this class, which is why did the Crusades emerge in Western Europe? What led to this peculiar version of religious warfare that had as its objective the capture of the holy city of Jerusalem, which for all Europeans in 1095 was literally the center of the world?